Hello. This is Georgia Court. I'm the proprietor at bookstore number 1, and I'm so happy to see all of you with us this evening. Just a couple of pieces of business. If you are not one of the speakers, please stay on mute. When the speakers have finished with their chat, there will be time for you to unmute and to converse with them. But just to prevent distractions, if you stay muted during their presentation, that will be very, very helpful. Also, in the chat, I have placed links to purchase Ben Montgomery's book, Shot in the Moonlight, as well as James Chapin's book, Ride South Until the Sawgrass. And those are links to purchase the book from Bookstore 1. So I hope you'll do that. I hope if you've not already purchased the book that you'll be moved to do so after you hear tonight's presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two speakers and turn it over to them. Ben Montgomery is a former enterprise reporter for the Tampa Bay Times and founder of the narrative journalism website gangrey.com. In 2010, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in local reporting and won the Dart Award and Casey Medal for a series called For Their Own Good about abuse at Florida's oldest reform school. He lives in Tampa with his children, and he is the author of The Man Who Walked Backward, The Leper Spy, and Grandma Gatewood's Walk. He'll be in conversation with James Chapin, who is a writer from Florida. His work has been published in Slate, Image Journal, The Millions, and the Tampa Bay Times. He currently lives in Athens, Georgia, with his wife and their animals, so we're welcoming him from a distance, I suppose. So welcome both Ben and James, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate this, and thank you all for tuning in. James and I go way back, and so we got together at least back a few years, right, James?
Yeah.
So we got together in advance of this and decided we were just going to wing it a little bit and see where this interesting conversation takes us. I would love to tell you about the book that I've written that came out in January. But first, I want to ask James to give us a pitch on his book. Tell us about it. What do we got here? Sell us.
What do we have here? We have a story from deep in the heart of what Florida is to me. Specifically, and it's specifically a group of pioneer families who are coming down in the mid 1800s and trying to survive on this brutal but beautiful landscape, and succeeding mostly. I was just so drawn to this period and really just felt compelled to write about it. And we mostly stick with one family, surnamed the Quintos, and they are representing one way of living life in a place like this, which is with humility, with understanding that you are not greater than your surroundings, and you are that the people around you deserve respect and to be well treated. And some other people maybe don't feel quite that way. Some other groups of people in this time and place, but maybe that's one pitch. That might be a slow pitch, right? If we're talking types of pitch, that's like a slow pitch, or maybe a curveball or something. I don't know. But Ben, let's tell me now. It's your turn.
Let's stay on you for half a second more, if you don't mind. Okay. Tell us about. So it's hard to get Florida in the middle of the 19th century right. Having been asked once to read a novel by a person who set a book in the 1920s in Florida, I'm aware of the mistakes that one can make about making assumptions about how we do things down here. I seem to recall this novel, and I'm not going to name any names or embarrass anybody, but this novel started off with a woman squeezing the trigger of a shotgun from about 20 yards away from an alligator and literally blowing the alligator's head off, which in my experience with guns can't be done from 20 yards away with the shotgun. How, and I didn't notice any similar mistakes in your factual mistakes in this book that you have imagined. So what did you do? What links did you go to recreate that era in this wild and interesting state?
I feel as though if you're in certain places, you can just be walking down a street or driving down a road, or walking through a patch of maybe pine forest, somewhere in North Florida or Central Florida, or inland Florida, anywhere, and you can darn well mistake yourself for being in a very different time and place, and that's still there, and that's accessible. So I think I did a lot of that. I think I did a lot of walking down fallen in roads, and definitely a lot of moseying around in the pine flats.
You're trying to tell us there are still wild parts of Florida?
I think so. And wild's a funny, yeah. Wild, let's call it wild. And I think that people observing Florida from afar would maybe agree in a different type of wild. Like that word is broad, and it takes in people as well as places, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and so I've spent time just obviously there's the old story, there's research, and there's also I was fortunate, I was blessed enough to work in a couple of settings where I was kind of doing lens management work and able to just hang out a lot outdoors in Florida, which I feel like we should all do more. I know that you, Mr. Montgomery, are known to be a little bit of a wanderer in those areas too, so you know what I'm talking about.
A little bit.
So
how about very practical things like getting the clothing right, getting the dialogue right, the patter, because all of that in your book sounded spot on to me. Was that hard work? Lifestyle stuff, building a fire, taking a wagon over a game trail, that sort of thing.
Yeah. It's a lot of work. It was, I won't lie on that, but it's just a matter of doing the reading and latching on to the things that you read that just feel right, I think, and feel like they were, spoke to you. And I didn't, I stuck to the things that really, that inspired me, honestly. And I wrote in that direction, and that's kind of, in the research, in, coming across things, little accounts, there's a wealth of books, and accounts therein where you can discover these things in archives. I've been in some dusty archives too, but just latching onto the things that move you, that moved me anyway.
Was this when you and I first met, going back 5 or more years, was this in the works? Tell us about your process. How long had this been inside of you before it came out?
Yeah, it's been more than one book. This book has not been one thing. And not just like it changed, but no, it was literally two, like there's another thing out there that's floating around, and there's a book's worth of material that, was wisely removed by my very wise editor. for time's sake, for efficiency's sake. But it's so that'd been in there for a while, definitely before you and I crossed paths, and I believe at Seminole Heights somewhere. It'd been there, and it's a long road, like anything getting published, as I think. Yeah.
And you're not a writer by trade. We, this is a side gig for you. Am I right?
I think it's my main gig masquerading as a side gig. And it's working that way for now. It's so far that's a manageable tightrope walk. So and it's been fun. I've learned from the work I've done.
Is there another one in you?
Oh man, it's in me. It depends if it's is it out into the world? That's the question. It's in me? Is it, where else is it going to be? But no, yeah, there's more out there, man. Yes, there's more to say. There's a lot more. Yeah.
What have you learned from this process, from doing a book and then selling a book when it's almost done, and then sending it out into the world? Because I imagine this. So I'm losing touch with the feeling of that first one. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And also all of mine are nonfiction, and so they're sold in advance based on a proposal. You're actually doing the hard work of writing this thing before you're turning the manuscript over to somebody, hoping that they'll buy it, right? So take us through that process.
Man, it was just to talk about that moment. I didn't do much else for a couple of years other than write this book. And that's where it came from. And you're right. I mean, it's just the mechanics of the book trade, right? Like, if with fiction, you have to have had it written, and that was so it had to be done, and it was done, and not painlessly, but but once it was out, again, it took years. I was one of these smart dudes who thinks that you could come in and say, hey, I wrote something in this, and I think it's not so bad, so now let's everybody feel the same way. And that didn't happen. And I had not published hardly a word at all. I had no publication credits to my name. So I came in the exact wrong angle and had to find my way back, through, I mean, part of it was just because I wanted to, part of it was because my brilliant wife decided that I should try writing a little bit of journalism and trying to get, a couple credits here and there. And, and eventually it came through, but releasing, this year, it's been a great exercise. And I think, Ben, you'll be able to speak to this too. Like, your book came out in 2020 as well. Like, we're kind of like bound by this situation that we kind of went through, where in my mind, I was going to be out and every copy in the world is going to be there because I put it in someone's hands, right? Like, right. Physically, like, hey, here's this. And it just didn't work that way. And it was all about just letting go of that preconception.
Yeah.
And I know that for you with this wonderful and scintillating piece of work, I don't think this is probably how you envisioned it either. But how does it feel now?
You mean the selling side of it?
I mean, just releasing this year, having it come out into the world, in 2020 when you couldn't go places and talk about George Denny.
Well, you know what? I don't know how many people are regular customers of Copperfish Books, but my favorite bookstore on the west coast of Florida. And every time I I put a book out, the good people at Copperfish come up with some cookies or cakes that are themed to the book that I've just written. And it's the biggest treat of my year. It's better than any award getting a cake with hiking boots on it to represent Grandma Gatewood's walk is huge. And unfortunately, you can't eat cake via Zoom. And so it's robbed me of the ability to meet people that I love and that I've come to know. And that part of it is unfortunate. Yeah. So I'll be curious to see how book sales turn out, you know, a few months out. I think people are still reading a lot, you know, but certainly connecting in this relatively awkward way with readers is a big deal. I feel like if I can get in front of a crowd of people who are interested in buying a book, then I'm going to be pretty successful in selling them the book that I've written. And that's just a little harder online. You know, I'm not quite as gregarious on Zoom as I am in person, because I can't stand up and walk around and throw my arms up and shake your hand, for heaven's sakes, or give you a hug and kiss your cheek. We're not doing that anymore. At least we've put that on hiatus.
Right.
So being robbed of that hurts. But,
I hope maybe Copperfish will give you a post facto cake. We'll see. We'll see if we could gin up some sales through Copperfish, and maybe there'll be a belated shot in the moonlight.
You know what? That's why I'm in it, for the cake.
Yeah,
I do. I
think so.
Do this hard work for cake.
Yeah. And full. I'm trying to envision what the shot in the moonlight cake would be.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's a wise book, and it's a fascinating book.
Let me tell people about it, if that's okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right. So on a cold night in January of 1897, 25 gun-hung white men rode up to the home of a freed slave named George Denning. Denning was inside of a little cabin that he built with his own hands on land he bought outright from the man who used to own his family, slaveholder by the name Denning also. And these men on his lawn that night demanded he come outside. He was asleep inside with his wife and kids, about half of his 11 kids. He refused to come outside. And this, it should be said, this is about 5 years after the famed muckraking journalist Ida B. Wells wrote in her paper in Memphis that, the Winchester rifle deserves a place of honor in every Black home to provide the law, to provide protection that the law refuses to provide. And so when things got more dramatic there at George Denning's house, when he refused to come out, somebody started firing shots into his back door. He was under attack. His family was under attack. He grabbed his own shotgun and ran upstairs. And when he threw open the shutters, the upstairs door, he saw a man standing on the ground below. A bullet entered his forehead, didn't kill him, but it scraped the top of, barely missed, scraped the top of his forehead, right as he squeezed off one shot from his shotgun. And that bullet, it was birdshot, actually. That birdshot struck and killed a 32-year-old scion of the wealthiest farm family in southwestern Kentucky. It was a guy named Jody Kahn. And this set in motion an incredible plot that started with Denning fleeing for his life. The mob returned to his house and burned his house to the ground, chased his wife and kids off, set fire to his barn and his gear house and his fields. Denning surrendered to the sheriff, who then started moving him from place to place because the mob was after him. He wound up in Louisville before being brought back about 6 months later to Simpson County, Kentucky for a trial. He was convicted by an all-white jury of manslaughter and sentenced to 7 years in prison. It was clear to the people of Kentucky, most of them, that this guy had done nothing but defend himself and his wife and his family from attack. And so the people of Kentucky, both white and Black, came out in support of Denning, and they called on the governor to pardon him. Letters poured in, to the governor's office by the hundreds, saying, free this man, and he doesn't deserve to be in prison. Many of them made the case that he was a hero for protecting himself and his family. So the governor pardoned Denning. and the day he left prison in Eddyville, Kentucky, he started looking for revenge. He went to Louisville and went on a speaking circuit of Black churches. We talked about the case and what had happened to him. He was the first Black man in the South to ever be pardoned for killing a white man, and so far as I could find. And word got out that he was thinking about a lawsuit against the mob that had tried to kill him that night, and that he had found a lawyer in a Southern man, a Louisville man named Bennett Young, who was a Confederate soldier.
Bennett Young.
Young had interestingly, had led a raid out of Canada into New Albans, Vermont, the northernmost land action of the Civil War, when these young Confederates came down and took hostage of this town in Vermont and held it for about 24 hours before riding away with all their money back into Canada. Anyways, Young was going to represent Denning. Word got out. Somebody found Denning in the night in Louisville. And you know, who did this is lost to time, but somebody beat him up. For all I know, tried to kill him. They cracked his head open with a brick. They gouged out one of his eyes, and they left him for dead, you know, in a dark alleyway. He was found. He was treated at a local hospital. He recovered and wound up suing, actually filing a lawsuit against the lynch mob in federal court with the help of this guy, Bennett Young, this Confederate soldier turned lawyer. And then I don't want to tell you any more, or you won't read the book. But to get the climactic finale of this fascinating true story, you can plunk down $28 plus whatever discount you get there at Bookstore One, Sarasota, or Copperfish Books in Punta Gorda, and I will be happy. My kids will be happy that you did that. So it's a story that you know, I've done a couple that are you know that highlight the cool things that people have done, including Grandma Gatewood's Walk, who you know, the story of the first woman to solo through hike the Appalachian Trail. She did it at the age of 67. I did The Leper Spy, which was about a woman who's completely forgotten, but she was a spy for the U.S. during World War II and did great things, saved hundreds of soldiers' lives. But then my most recent one about a guy who tried to walk backward around the world in the Great Depression seems sort of frivolous, you know, in hindsight. Of all the books that I've done, this one I think is the most timely, even though it's set in 1897, because the things that we're talking about today, the things that we're debating today, especially now, right as you know, the trial of Derek Chauvin, who is accused of killing George Floyd, is playing out in Minneapolis. These are the topics of conversation that we're dealing with: police brutality, racial justice, Confederate statuary. What do we do with the legacy of the South that we sort of live with? We didn't inherit it. We certainly live with it. Right down the street is a place that was formerly called Lee Elementary, one of the oldest elementary schools in the city of Tampa, so named in the 1920s when there was this movement to rename a lot of infrastructure after Confederate soldiers, Confederate heroes. This was named for General Lee, of course. And only now, about 6 months ago, was that school renamed. And we're considering that as a society right now in places all over the country. Like, what do we do with the legacy of the Confederacy? Are these men meant to be remembered? And it extends beyond the Confederacy, right? You know, two of the guys on Mount Rushmore owned other human beings. There's no other way to put that, right? Like, two founding fathers, men that our history books pay homage to, owned other human beings. And this is what we wrestle with as a people right now. Like, that great moral question that came around when you know, at this time when you're writing about early Florida and when I'm writing about early Kentucky, is, you know, that the one driving question was, how do you come down on the great issue of that day? And in many ways, sort of it's not the great issue of today, but we're left to deal with the repercussions of those choices we made back then. And it seems like so much is linked to the experience of African Americans in the U.S. and you know, and then how we are navigating that that territory now.
Right. I mean, and it's funny, like you're operating sort of outside of the like big mythical moments though in American history, at least American race history, the history of American race. So you're post Civil War, pre Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
There's a long period of history in there. And as you quite rightly state, the history of that period, and direct quote from your book, is the history of these decades is white.
Yeah. I mean, the historians were white. The writers were white. The newspaper editors, newspaper reporters were white. Finally, we had people like Ida B. Wells and others who were starting and running Black newspapers. But that period is a very white period, and you find incidents that, I mean, I started noticing as I'm reading hundreds and hundreds of newspapers from that era, mostly around Kentucky. I began to notice that that if you were Black, you got in the newspaper in just a couple of ways. You were either being marched to your death the day before, and this was often the case, especially in that period. There were stories of lynchings in the newspaper, on the front page of the newspaper almost every day. You're either being marched to your death, or you were the subject of ridicule for something you had done. And this was just a consistent thing in that era. And so a lot of the Black history is lost. George Denning was illiterate. There's no indication that he ever learned to read or write. And so a historian examining his life has really limited opportunities to learn about him, certainly about what he was thinking and what he was doing at that time. It made my job a lot more difficult. You can't rely on personal papers. There's no diary to reflect how he was feeling the night that these white men showed up at his house and started shooting through his doors. From my perspective, you go after the facts by casting a big wide net. I got, the governor's papers in Kentucky, thank goodness, contained a full transcript of his criminal trial. That same file contained some letters from George Denning's wife that she had written to the governor, arguing for his lenience and for him to pardon George Denning. And she betrayed what the family was going through at the time. So there's some useful facts. And then I went to like interesting ephemera, like I can't even think of what these are called. Like estate sales, which thank goodness the Simpson County Historical Society has done a fantastic job of keeping a lot of these records. But I found estate sales where George Denning's name showed up as a customer to these, as a purchaser at these estate sales. So he bought like, rusty hay hooks for 42 cents at this estate sale. And he bought a spotted cow at this estate sale. So you could see him and you could sort of track his movements around Simpson County in those days leading up to this sudden sort of fame that he got. He was being written about in newspapers across the country. The New York Times hired a correspondent to cover the criminal trial in Simpson County, Kentucky. So once he enters the sort of public atmosphere, you get to know a lot more about him. But leading up to that, figuring out what his life was like, whether his family ate off woodware or some other kind of early, mid 19th century dishes, those things were hard to figure out. But I wanted to create a picture in the mind's eye of the reader as accurately as possible, to give them a sense that they were there, so you can see things playing out, in that era. And it was a tall order, but a lot of fun work.
So speaking of tall orders, and speaking of, feeling like maybe a weight of responsibility, one of the things that that was really quite a moment to me was during your book release, and George Denning's great grandson, was it, jumped on the Zoom call, just spoke up,
Yeah.
like from one of the Zoom squares that we're in right now. George Denning just his name isn't George Denning, but one of his grandsons is,
Anthony.
yeah,
Anthony Denning, yeah.
right. But right, and so a descendant was there, and you could tell there's two things. There's one was, you know, there's just the fact that this story is coming out, and the fact that they were willing to share this story of this brave, incredibly brave, um, forebear of theirs with you. Um, that's not a small thing.
Yeah.
And it clearly, I mean, that must feel like a challenge. I say a little bit about that. Like you're dealing with someone's great grandfather.
Yeah. I didn't find the family until I had already done quite a bit of work, but I knew that was going to be a part of it. And I was thinking, like, I can um, I can run you with some accuracy up about 4 or 5 rungs up my own family tree. And that's pretty odd for a guy who grew up in Oklahoma, because I think my people disconnected from their past and became like true pioneers and settlers around the time of the land run. And so that I can find my way up 4 or 5 rungs is, I think, pretty cool. A lot of friends of mine cannot do that. But I knew that in that same way, like, I could connect my own personal privilege with an ancestry that that gave me that. My paternal grandfather got a PhD in physical engineering from Oklahoma State University. His mother was in the first female class at Oklahoma State University around the time of Oklahoma statehood. I am a beneficiary of that education and of their experiences. I wanted to see whether the descendants of George Denning inherited anything in particular from that experience that he had, whether it was, at the risk of betraying the climactical beauty of the story, whether they had inherited some proceeds from his court success, or whether they had inherited a part of the trauma that family must have experienced for those 4 or 5 years where they were in the spotlight and where they were, chased off their home and threatened and almost killed, etc. So I feel lucky to have found them, and I think the continuation of that is that, and many of them have found success, including Anthony, who's a successful business owner in Indianapolis. But they can't find he can't find his great grandfather's grave. There's no indication where George Denning was buried. We know the cemetery, but there's no marker. Some records were lost, so they have no way to memorialize him in the way that a lot of people do, like visiting a grave and leaving flowers and that sort of thing, which is
right,
in my mind, a sort of human right. And they're robbed of that, unfortunately. But it speaks to that, as so many Black people are. I'm engaged in a project right now where a friend is trying to map lost Black cemeteries in the city of Tampa. And there are lots of them that have been paved over and forgotten and built over and so forth. And with disregard and maybe even for racist reasons, like nobody will care about the Black cemetery. Let's go ahead and plow a road through there, So it's like purposefully disconnecting people from their legacy, from their history. And that was true with George Denning. But that his family welcomed me in and allowed me to tell their story. And I really did seek permission. I would have abandoned this project, I think, had they said, no, you're the wrong guy to do this. But they welcomed me in and helped me as they could. Anthony's done a lot of his own research he knew that his grandfather had done something significant. And by the way, it's the first time that a Black man anywhere in America had sued his would-be lynchers for damages. And so it broke the mold in that way. And in subsequent years, you saw other people go to federal court to try to seek justice from somebody who'd done them wrong. Other Black people to seek justice from, for some misdeed from a white neighbor or many white people. So reviving that and helping, put it in book form, which for whatever reason makes it feel more permanent or more with us, or I don't know, it gives people a chance to re-engage with that story when we can look at it from this kind of distance. It feels significant. I feel proud of this book in a way that I haven't necessarily felt proud of work that I've done before. Not that I'm not proud of that. It's just, it's a different kind of pride,
Well, I mean, look, as a fan of previous works, but I think what you're putting your finger on is just like, this moment that we're in, this book, this is part of the conversation, and I think you were just doing your job as a writer, and doing your job including as a reporter, and as someone who can find these stories and bring them to life. You were just doing your thing. And lo and behold, like, here's this moment that needs to hear this story. And you just spoke into it just by merit of just wanting to tell about this man and what he did. And it's just kind of one of those things, I'm assuming, like.
It is funny that an event that happened in 1897 can somehow feel timely, but like I think I write in the book, in many ways the Civil War never really ended. I mean, we kind of called it off, but there's still skirmishes playing out in all sorts of places. I think we're seeing that in Minneapolis right now. So it's an interesting time to be alive. And also, I don't consider myself an historian, but I do think of myself as a student of history and somebody interested in retelling those stories in ways that make them real to us today. So I'm pleased as punch. By the way, let me invite people, if you have any questions for me or James, please use that chat box, and we'll be happy to try to.
And also, you're happy to, the chat box is fine if you want to use it.
Oh.
But if you'd like to ask a question, unmute yourself. We have a small enough group that I think that makes it easy. And by the way, I see the wonderful ladies from Copperfish Books here, and it's always wonderful. I'm Bookstore 1 in Sarasota, and Copperfish Books is down in Punta Gorda, and we are friends, and we have done several of these joint Zoom calls together, and it always makes it extra special because there are people from Punta Gorda, there are people from Tampa, there are people from Sarasota, and from other places, I'm sure, on the call. So, okay, anyone want to jump into this conversation or ask a question?
I see one here. How did you first learn about your character, Mr. Denning? Thank you for the question. I was finishing a project for the Tampa Bay Times. This is going back a few years. Do you remember after the shooting death of Michael Brown started some protests in and around Ferguson, Missouri, which sort of spread to cities across the country? That was 2014, I think. I got upset that when I learned that nobody keeps track of police shootings. There's no government system that keeps tabs on the number of times a police officer, in a certain area shoots and kills someone. I thought at a minimum, I had just done a project that actually looked at some other petty crimes. And I learned that, FDLE could tell me in any given year how many purses were snatched, but not how many times police shot people in the state of Florida. And I was miffed by that. And I was ranting about it at a staff meeting one day. And my editor, Bill Duryea, said, well, do that story. Why don't you find out? And I thought, well, goodness gracious, that's going to be a lot of work. So 3 years later, I was wrapping up that project. We asked 400 law enforcement agencies across the state of Florida for any reports generated when an officer shot a citizen. And so, and we started tabulating it and seeing what we could learn from those reports. And long story short, 3 years later, we did a piece, but I realized that I had spent a long time. So one of the big takeaway from this was that 40% of people shot by police in the state of Florida, our numbers showed, were Black. And that compares with about 15% of the population in Florida Black. And so, so those were out of whack. And I spent a lot of time hanging out with some mothers who had lost husbands and kids to, in police shootings. And I realized near the end of that I was longing for a story that didn't end in tragedy. And so I quite purposefully went searching for a book, for an episode in history that might be worthy of exploration, that dealt with somebody who had been the victim of a crime or an attempted crime, and then had gone in search of vengeance or revenge or retribution or justice. And poking around in the historical archive is one of my favorite things in the world to do. I can spend no small amount of time just reading old newspaper stories. And so using a series of various search terms, I stumbled across this story of George Denning in 1897, and then started reading consecutively how it played out, and started thinking maybe this makes a book. And then I hired a person to go do some research for me in Kentucky to see if there was enough first-person source material that might fill in some gaps for me and might help me tell this story in an impactful way. If there's enough material there for a book, that's what I was wondering.
And there was.
And there was. And when I learned that the criminal trial transcript existed, I thought, boy, this is a chance to use that, like create a sort of courtroom drama, but all based in fact, and to really use that as a compelling element of this narrative. So it scratched an itch for me. Here was a guy who had been wronged and who had the courage to pursue justice legally through the court system, and happened to befriend and engage a former Confederate soldier, not just any former Confederate soldier, like a real son of the South. And Bennett Young, after this trial was long over, Bennett Young did more than any man, any of his contemporaries, to try to preserve and advance the myth of the lost cause. He built Confederate statues across the country. He raised the money for the Jefferson Davis Memorial in Western Kentucky. It was the tallest monument of its kind outside of the Washington Monument. He gave the eulogy at, is it Winnie or Minnie Davis's, Jeff Davis's daughter, founder of the Daughters of the Confederacy. He gave the eulogy at her funeral, gave keynote speeches at the unveiling of Confederate statues in New Orleans and Charleston and elsewhere. So on one hand, Bennett Young helped people like George Denning, Black men and women, with access to the courts, and also founded an orphanage for Black children. And on the other hand, he helped preserve the legacy of of the South, of the Confederacy. And those two things aren't necessarily opposite. I feel like there is a lot to explore in like the gray area in between those ideas. And that's why, in my mind, Bennett Young it just makes a really dramatic and interesting character, because he seems to represent these two viewpoints, one progressive and justice oriented, and the other was, really meant to convince Americans at large that the Confederate soldiers fought with valor and also fought to preserve states' rights over something that Young identified as being problematic and being part of the past, which was slavery.
Contradictions on contradictions here. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
American history.
That's right.
That's kind of what we're talking about there.
Yeah. Anyone else have something you want to add or ask about?
Well, let me just, first of all, let me proudly admit that I'm Jamie Chapin's father. And, and delighted to be here and reveling in all I'm hearing and so forth. I want to speak, Ben, to something about your work.
Yes, sir.
Jamie and I came from a very interesting tradition insofar as we had a member of our family, quote unquote, who worked for my grandmother as a gardener. And as a little kid, I followed him around all over the place. The short story is he was one of the brightest guys I've ever known. But with an education equal to yours and Jamie's and mine and so forth, who knows where he would have gone.
Sure.
This is in the 50s, and here we are quite a bit forward from that. We now have the chance to, let's say, redeem ourselves in a positive way by telling the stories, Ben, of what you're telling of someone who overcame, and to start to develop stories of people who have overcome the lack of education denied them because of their color. Right. And I think your book, in an indirect way, works very, very well toward that goal. And I laud you on it. I can't wait to get a copy, hopefully on discount, and to be able to say that this is the kind of work that is important on many levels, and not the least of which is we have a chance to turn the page, shall we say, right. And develop minds that we never knew we had available to us to participate in our society. So I just wanted to throw that out as a comment and mention I'm very impressed with what you've said about your work and your background and so forth, and to assertively say that I'm almost as impressed with your book as I am of Jamie's. Not quite, but almost. And so thank you.
It's an interesting point you make about turning the page, because I think we are at a time in history where historians are starting to recognize that so much of what we have sort of collectively thought we knew doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And my best personal anecdote is this memory I have of being about in the 4th or 5th grade. This would have been 1989, I think. And in celebration of the centennial of the Oklahoma land run, they made us all dress up in pioneer clothing, and they gave us 4 stakes and sent us out into the playground where we were told to stake out our own land, our settlement, and sit and have our picnic lunch. And that was our territory, our property. Well, they never told us that that land had previously been granted to Native Americans who'd been driven at gunpoint to Oklahoma from states in the Southeast. It just wasn't a part of our learning or our understanding of that land run. And so it seems wrong to me in such a big way as an adult. But I think finally we're, I don't know if it's turning the page, but finally we're starting to scrutinize our institutional understanding of American history. And I think as much as it's been badgered over the past couple of years, the New York Times 1619 Project, led by Hannah Nicole Jones, which recasts the history of America, placing African Americans in their proper context in terms of building the White House and lending so much to American culture in the way of music and fashion and art and industry and so forth, recasting that to remove maybe some of those layers of white supremacy and white memory to make room for contributions of people of color. And in my mind, it's high time for that. You know, it's been far too long.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, there's also the piece about majority, minority, and so forth that Jamie brings out in his book, because of course a lot of it has to do with what happens when the breakdown between the new coming settlers and the historic owners, when that breaks down. And I think it's important and fascinating to have read in James' book how this sort of plays out. And there are parallels with all sorts of other majority, minority instances that we can learn from in looking at that.
And one thing I really want to point to, you know, as we're talking to a lot of people who are in the state of Florida or who have deep connections to it, is, you know, look a little closer at this history and talk about complexity, talk about, nuance. Like, so obviously we're on indigenous soil, as you are virtually anywhere on this continent. And you can say these settlers came and dispossessed people, which is true. Or did they? Right? Because in Florida, we have the unconquered people. We have the Seminoles of Florida, who I think are probably maybe the foremost example of people who just refuse to be dominated by whatever this thing is that's in the American, Euro-American, white American, whatever's in that worldview, it stopped short at the Seminole tribe.
Yeah.
And it stopped short
The
at
only tribe to be unconquered, right?
And so first you have that in Florida, and it's something I don't think we really look at enough. I don't think that we really celebrate that enough, or allow it to be celebrated by people in the tribe themselves. And we should really look to that as with and honor it. The title of the book, kind of Ride South Until the Sawgrass, it kind of got Frankenstein together by a few people. Like, it was sort of a committee job. And it kind of turned out all right. But, as I'm sort of retroactively kind of, put more meaning to it, the Imperial American movement, it flows all the way west and it flows south. Florida's the southern frontier at one point. That's what it's called. That's one of my favorite, by the way, one of my favorite little newspaper anecdotes is Florida was called the southern frontier. I'll always love that.
Yeah.
And this like imperial movement just flows throughout this continent, and it rides on its horses and draws its ox-drawn wagons, and they come and they claim territory, but they stop short, at least in the case of Florida, at the Sawgrass, and they ride until the Sawgrass. You getting me?
Right.
And so, and I think that's just kind of serendipity how that title turned out. But because what we're talking about in with that story is like, people just trying to, on some level, people trying to make a life for themselves in a pretty rough spot, right?
Yeah.
Future Sunshine State. Yeah. So people
I went down.
What's that?
I went down a few years ago with a guy who was a friend of the Seminoles and hung out down there for a while, and wound up taking a boat ride with them to celebrate the journey of this woman named Paula Parker, who I'll bet you nobody on this call has heard of. Essentially at the end of, I think, the Third Seminole War, they had staged a bunch of Seminoles on Egmont Key, and they brought a big steamer down to take them up to the Mississippi River so they could disembark and be put on the Trail of Tears and sent to Oklahoma. And among the prisoners was a Seminole named Paula Parker, who convinced that St. Mark's in the Panhandle of Florida convinced the soldiers, her captors, to let her go into the woods to seek some medicine for some sick Seminoles that were on the boat. And when they let her go, she ran. Well, she made it all the way, walking only at night by the light of the moon, made it all the way from St. Mark's back to Fish Eating Creek on Lake Okeechobee, which is something like, 600 miles by foot, walking through the woods. And this would have been what, James, 1849 or something? When was the Third Seminole War?
There's a book.
Yeah.
1853.
18, yeah.
Something like that.
So while there are stories to be told, and I don't know if anybody's ever done a book about Paula Parker. And this was, a lot of it, as often the case with folks who weren't afforded an education to learn to read and write. The stories are passed down in folklore. So there's nothing really written about Paula Parker from that era, at least, that would, historians rely on public records to help tell the stories, and historic documents and newspaper clippings and things like that. But none of that existed in Florida in that era. And so what we know about Paula Parker is that, there are a bunch of Seminoles right now who are alive because she made that journey. She repopulated the tribe. And so they tell her story.
And
So
that leads me to maybe one final question for both of you. Well, maybe Ben, you're going to write the Polly Parker book. Do either of you have projects? I know your books are new, really, because they just came out. But what are you thinking of writing next? Any plans?
Go ahead.
I'm engaged in a ghostwriting project, and I took a job a couple of months ago with a new media company called Axios. I'm writing a daily Tampa Bay newsletter. And in fact, I spent all day down. I took the boat out early this morning and went down to the Piney Point area around Port Manatee to take some water samples with a friend, just to double check whether the pH levels are accurate that the DEP is telling us about. So we're just looking over their shoulder a little bit down there. Anyways, I'm so super busy doing this newsletter for Axios that I'm going to put the next book on hold for a little while. Maybe start working on it early next year. Don't tell my agent that if she's on this call.
It'll be our secret. How about you, James? Any plans?
Well, as Ben helpfully reminded us, with fiction, I have to have something completely done before it goes anywhere. So I got a little ways to go before that happens with anything. But I'm engaged in I got like a battle going on inside myself and also inside of my knowledge about which book I write next. I have, and open up to the floor. We got something that is not at all. It's like a sequel to Ride South into the Sawgrass, but it's in 1800s Florida, same kind of atmosphere. And then I also have something that is set during the 1998 fires in Volusia County, and sort of a group of kind of like on the skids folks who lived through that. And those are my two things. So that's my answer. I have a couple things going.
Well, good. Well, it sounds like you're going to be busy, certainly for a while. All of you are. And I just have to say thank you to everyone who joined us tonight, to our two authors. It has been a terrific evening. And with that, we'll say good night.
Thank you so much,
Good night.
Bookstore One and Copperfish.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Mwah.
Very
Good
interesting.
night. Thank you, Georgia.
Thank you.
Georgia.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Awesome. Hang on.